Hello, I'm Juniper Owens, Director of the Academy of Integrative Mental Health, and your host for today's episode, which is our topic of the month. And for this topic of the month, I spoke with Robin Monson-Dupuis about grieving as a mental health professional. We discussed topics about the unique experience of grief as a therapist, returning to work after loss, tending to our grief, considerations on what and how to discuss our grief with clients, and how differently people grieve and respond to devastating life events. Robin has been a psychotherapist and substance abuse counselor for over 30 years. She's been a leader in her workplace, her church, and her community. She continues to travel on a journey of healing, often not knowing where that will take her, but trying to trust the process. Her book is Spirit Son. Robin, thank you so much for hopping back on to the podcast to share your heart and wisdom and thoughts with us today.
I'm very pleased to be here.
You're someone that I've really gotten to know. Obviously, we've spoken, but also through your words and your book and your writing, and I feel really close to you through a lot of that. So thank you for sharing that.
You are so welcome. We need to share with each other.
Right? And there's so many ways to connect. And you and I also have connected in a way that I would have preferred not to, which is being in grief. And we've both lost our sons.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to talk with you because you're definitely further along your grief path than I am.
Journey, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I recently just got back to work, which was a huge deliberation for me. When I say work, I mean my clinical practice.
Mm-hmm.
And it was confusing for me because, as you know, I feel so different as a human. And that also translated to how will I practice now and also care for myself. So I'd love to kind of go over a few questions that I had, and I've asked some other therapists who are grieving, and just get a sense of your perspective of how you walked through this process yourself.
Yeah, love to.
And I know that I actually called you. You were so generous and kind to share your time with me, but I called you and I said, how will I know I'm ready to go back? Because I took a significant amount of time off, and I'm privileged to do so. So for you, or if another clinician was to ask you something like that, yeah, how would you respond to that?
Well, so taking time away from our clinical work when we are dealing with loss, whether that loss is the loss that it seems to be impervious or pervasive in our culture, COVID, the division in our country, all of the stress going on in the larger global environment, or or a tragic loss, such as a loss of a child or a spouse, such as you and I losing our sons. When we experience that kind of deep down to the bones loss, taking time away is absolutely critical. You know, you think of a little deer in the woods who's lost its mama. It kind of lays in and just stays put for a while. And so we need to do the human version of that. And if we are privileged, as you pointed out, to take time away, that's time at first, those first months, the 6 months, that first year, that we can just kind of cocoon in and do a lot of inner healing. It's a journey for sure. And this is a long journey. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And initially taking that time away is critical. And I think I took a year. I actually left my corporate healthcare job as an outpatient director of behavioral health and took a year. I just absolutely needed to do that. Not everybody's able to, but I was. And I think that time away is so important in a sense that we might not necessarily think about. So think about, as therapists, what is the thing we do? What is the way that we heal our clients? Massage therapists use their hands. A surgeon uses, a scalpel, say. And yet we use our whole self. So our mind, body, spirit, our self is the instrument through which we heal. And we can't just use a tool or just a piece of our body, say our hands or just our voice. It's the whole being. And good therapists know that we just don't compartmentalize just words coming out of our mouths as the healing. It's our whole body. I remember in graduate school, I came across that phrase, manualized therapy. And I'm like, oh, there's a manual for this. If I just follow the manual, I'll be able to help people. No. The more the older we get and the longer we're in the field, and I've been in the field over 30 years, the more we know, we don't know, right? So if our whole mind, body, spirit is the instrument through which healing comes forth to our clients, if our instrument is not healed in all of those areas, particularly our emotional self, and even especially our spiritual self, we're not going to be able to do that healing as effectively. So time away to begin with is, yes, really critical.
Yes, and I'm really glad you brought that up because that is part of why I feel that it is extremely unique when people talk about going back to work after a period of bereavement leave or mourning. And I think with our job in particular, it feels different to me. Maybe that's not true because I don't know. I don't work another job, so I don't understand the felt experience for that. But like you said, our instrument of our work is our bodies, and
Our souls,
early
even our
grief,
souls.
yes,
Yeah.
body, soul, all, I
Yeah.
mean, everything that encapsulates that. And the somatic experience of grief, all of that is really, I would say, for me, there was no way I would have been able to show up for quite some time. And
Mhm.
so moving into that arena, when you do feel that, or when you have to, because like we said, we have been privileged, like some people might have to go back sooner. What what for you was one way that you were able to care for yourself or or take the necessary steps of like um either grieving, support, whatever it is that you did to care
Mhm.
for your body, soul, spirit, mind, when you did enter back into those therapeutic relationships?
Well, that's a really good question. I have several things I would like to share. I'm the kind of person that if I'm going to do something, I go all in. So I,
You do.
first of all, I mean, at the ground level, I went back part-time. I did not go back full-time. I started a private practice in which I can control, as opposed to working for organized healthcare, I can control the pace. So I at first didn't see people back to back. Now I don't see more than 3 back to back. I make sure that I am pacing in a way that, because I do a lot of work with trauma, I traumatize clients as well as clients who are grieving some horrific losses, suicide, overdoses, that kind of thing. I need to, I can't have people back to back to back and just get so depleted. Um, so that was something I did. The other thing but though on a deeper level, because the loss of my son after 8-year journey with his with addiction, he was a victim of the opioid crisis, and by age 25, after all of those years, he was in and out of treatment and attempted suicide twice, and I did not realize to what degree was experiencing a spiritual crisis until after he died. I really had a crisis of faith, and my faith in God had always been something I relied on, and I lost that. I felt that God had abandoned my son, and why did he not save Ethan when he saved others? I certainly moved past that, but I needed to heal my faith. So I connected with a group of women, thankfully from my church, in which I could begin to heal my broken faith with God. That was critical. My spiritual faith, in kind of in something that transcended me, needed to be restored. Otherwise, I feel, you feel like, well, so I've just had this terrible thing happen. Like, why not just die now, right? Like, what else is there? So by spiritual, I also mean regaining a sense of meaning and purpose. When we suffer great tragedy or loss, we need to re kind of reconnect with maybe a shifted purpose, a shifted sense of meaning, because this work is hard. And if we're not grounded and refreshed by that, it can feel like a trudge, right? Thirdly, I sought therapy myself. I did some very great work with a very wise trauma therapist, and I who introduced me to brain spotting, which is a somatic way of healing trauma, so that we're not carrying it inside of our souls. And doing this work, we can release it, and that was game changing for me. And then finally, I have I'm so blessed to have a core group of women, three other therapists, and we have been walking together for now this year it'll be 15 years. We meet monthly. Just we don't socialize. We meet monthly for personal care and personal growth. And those women have walked with me and are like they're my group. And so though all those levels of support and healing all together were so critical in making sure the time I took off and the time that I still continue to devote to caring for myself is truly healing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I relate to a lot of what you're talking about. I think a lot of people will that are grieving as well that are listening to this, or maybe not. Maybe they resonate in other ways, but I think that's a important factor to consider because of the life changing, perception changing, earth shattering, experience of it that you said your loss in faith or how that shifted for you. And I think I had a similar experience, except for I'm more of a secular focused. Like I had more of a secular, maybe pagan kind of approach as far as my spirituality consisted with my relationship with the other than human world, natural world. And I remember the first few weeks, I thought that that's where I would take solace. And instead, I wanted the sun to go away. It was spring when my son died, and I was like, everything I didn't want to look at. I follow like owls, nesting owls and nesting like eagles. That's one of
Oh,
my spring rituals. And I didn't want to look at the babies, owls. I didn't want to watch their growth, or like, I didn't want to do the same things I felt. And so you said that kind of abandonment. There was a sense of that, but it was a little different. And I was completely shocked because that was one of my greatest sources of healing, peace, solace. And I was like, whoa, okay, that's been ripped away from me. What the?
mhm.
Like, I was very shocking. And so I do think that reconnecting and having some of those grounding, supportive in both the physical and spiritual world to be, to me, vital. And that sounds like to you too. But I will say that I feel a little different. I have great friends and great support systems, some who are clinicians and some who are not. I will say that I personally was really wanting professionally to have other clinicians that have had this type of loss and understood this grief, because some of the things that I'm wondering about, they kind of don't understand. Like, oh, well, you're such a good therapist. Why are you where you can hold space. You're doing it with me right now. And I'm like, it's different. Like that was one of my biggest concerns. So I kind of want to move to that
Mhm,
about holding space for clients. I've been looking in some of the articles or literature around grieving therapists, which there's not a lot. So
mhm.
there's room for us if we want to speak more about this, but and other clinicians as well, that there's concern that your own grief might change the therapeutic relationship, and that if clients know that you're grieving, they might not say certain things. There's so many dynamics within the therapeutic relationship that I think uh, clinicians are consider when they're working after such a life-changing experience. And so for you, how have you navigated that?
What I have found is, and I have talked with other therapists about this general notion, is that when we work with clients, and especially with clients who bring heavy grief, tragedy, loss, trauma, when we really meet them there, we start to take on a psychic charge of that emotion, and it imbues us. It gets in our cells and our skin. There's no way that if and when I was a younger therapist, I don't think I took on psychic charge because I don't think I was that engaged. I think that's something that comes with time, life experience, wisdom, age. maybe there's that really unique young therapist that has that, but I think that's something that comes over time, right? That's the art of our profession. It's not manualized, right? There's some art in it. And so if we don't discharge that kind of charge, we carry that over and over and layer upon layer, like a little, oyster, and the seed inside, or the irritating piece of sand. It overlays and overlays and overlays. We need to discharge that. So I think that we need to make sure that we're doing that regularly, so that we're not bringing those extra psychological charges just in our energy, because clients may not really know what it is that they're feeling from us, but they're feeling something. They can sense if we're heavy and burdened. They may not be able to actually articulate that, but I think they can sense that, just in the way that sometimes, people can just sometimes sense kind of what we're thinking or feeling, right? If they're attuned. So we need to be really mindful of that. And I think that when clients sense something about us, or when they just know that we've suffered a loss. For example, I wrote a book, and so some people come to my practice are having found me through my book, or they have attended my grief group that I facilitate. And should they, ask a question, uh, I might answer it, but only as a way to perhaps reassure them that I get it. I think that's what clients want to know, just about maybe
Yes.
anything. Do you get it? Do you get my life experience? And then, you know what? They then kind of want that to then end. Because if we go on any more other than reassuring them, I've had this lived experience, I get it, and tell me more about your experience. If we go further than that, what we do is we bring then our grief into the space, right? That is being held between therapist and client. And now our grief is in there. And then it can, particularly for empathic clients, it can actually shut down their communication of their grief and sorrow, because they're aware and sensitive to ours. So I think that we need to keep that the space clear. And as we hold space for our clients, we need to make sure that we clean out that space and take care of ourselves, so the space is free and open for their grief to fully enter it, and for us to be able to fully meet them there.
Oh, I love that. I think you brought up really good points in that, yes, some clients really can take that on. I actually did a poll in one of my online face groups that is not clinical, and it's a grief group that I've really enjoyed. And I kind of said, well, what would you want in a therapist? As a grieving therapist, because I was curious. I ask a lot of questions, and I put lots of feelers out because I'm just really curious of what. And I will say it was half and half. Some therapists really wanted someone with lived experience, and like you said, I'm sure they don't want you to like take over the session. That wouldn't be appropriate in any interaction with a mental health professional. However, like I had about half said that they wouldn't want someone in new grief because they want the sense of feeling that they can be really like the person's solid, and if they're not solid, how could that other person be solid? And also some of the things that people brought up, that they actually stopped seeing their therapist that they knew had lost a child, because this group is specifically for child loss, and because they just couldn't get over worrying that they were burdening them and things like that. So I also think that this leads us into, because everyone grieves differently, everyone has different needs to feel safe in their grief and in that experience of trauma, because a lot of grief comes with a lot of serious trauma. And then therapists grieve differently. And you and I kind of talked about this a little bit beforehand, like, so yeah, how do we kind of navigate all of that?
So that's an interesting point, that you got that feedback that a client would not want someone new in grief, because that's actually really an astute observation on their part. New grief, no matter if you're the best therapist in the world or new to the field, new grief just slams us all to the ground. It just does. Grief is just all incompatible. It's like a tsunami that just washes over you, and it takes a while to pick yourself up off that, that beach where you feel just totally wrecked, and pick yourself back up. And then, of course, there are those those follow-up tidal waves, right? There's those little lesser waves that keep rolling over you. So I did not see anybody um, suffering the loss of a child or a spouse for 2 years. So because it's very well known in the field of suffering the loss of a child that the second year can be worse than the first. And I think that's true for a lot of grief. After you've come through that first sort of year, the 12 months, and your head is clearer, and you're not numbed by the shock of it all, which thankfully is such a gift of our brains that it just allows a little bit of the awareness of the totality of the loss. The second year can be worse, as you realize you've got to rebuild your life. So I think that's important, because a newly grieving therapist is just not going to be able to set those boundaries sometimes. I mean, if you hear somebody else's story and you feel overwhelmed and almost on the verge of tears, that's a clue, that's a red flag that you're still really fragile. So I think that was a really astute comment to set a boundary, for therapists to set a boundary around that. Similarly, because my son struggled with addiction, and I'm a substance abuse counselor as well as a psychotherapist, I also have decided to not, and in the 6 years since he died, I do not see anybody in active addiction. I will see somebody who has a secondary diagnosis of addiction, who's in recovery and is looking to, strengthen that or maintain that. But active addiction, I don't. So I have had to set boundaries so that then I keep myself safe, and not triggered, and not triggered, because that can be a scary experience. Us therapists, we've probably all been in a session with a client who's telling a story, and all of a sudden we feel this upwelling and this triggering, and we're like, whoa, I'm being swamped here, right? And so that, I think, is an astute observation on the part of that person who answered your poll. I think lived
Yes.
experience, if it's well managed, can be an asset, though, to healing.
Yes, because, well, for me particularly, because like you said, and we're going to get more into this because of how everyone's so different, but also I was craving someone who had been through it. This was a big part of my grief. I felt so alone in what I felt that I just crave other people that, and since we're different, I know they don't know exactly my experience, but I just really wanted that, or someone with a ton of experience,
Mhm.
a ton of grief experience. And there was just certain things that I really wanted. So I think that if it was me, and what a lot of people said is that they would want someone
Mhm.
also that maybe has had a little time. And I know that I'm like coming up to a year. I am back at work, and I am seeing a few grief clients. And I was curious about that because for me, I just need to know what it feels like. I can't just guess. I have to just step in. I've been very open with my clients. Like, I'm kind of new, and we will see how we will see what happens. Some of them are previous clients who I know really well, and that's been interesting, uh, transition back. But for me, I think because of the way that I grieved and mourned, and the way that I continue to have a lot of space in my life for that, I'm really lucky because I don't have younger children. I don't have a ton of other responsibilities necessarily. And so I am able to dedicate a lot of time to tending to what comes up because, as you know this better than me, it changes. It's always new. I'll be moving through one thing and then I'm like, oh, and now this is a thing now. This is my new thing that I'm working with. And some of the traumas just now finally surfacing, some of the traumatic pieces of around his death and before. So anyway, the reason why I'm saying all that is because I feel that I have to tend to my grief probably more now that I'm back to work in the ways that are good for me. But I will say that I did want that personally as a therapist. And I think you and I get into this field, or a lot of people get into this field because they want to be helpful, but also from lived experience, from felt experiences. And I have like this passion that I just want to be helpful to others. So I have to always weigh that experience of, okay, are you actually being helpful? And so I just want to always be being very mindful of if there's ever a part where I'm actually not being helpful, if I'm not being, the therapeutic experiences jeopardized, I guess you could say, then I will make adjustments.
Mhm.
What do you notice with that, especially the piece on how everyone grieves differently and how therapists might grieve differently around them?
Well, so that's such a good point. Just as every human being is different, and there will never be another you, Juniper, and there'll never be another me. So we bring our uniqueness not only to our joy and living our life in the sun, but we also bring our uniqueness to our dark places and our losses. One of the things that I did, because after we lost our son to overdose, I didn't know anybody who had that experience. And what I did in that year I took off, I read every book I could get my hands on about grief, as not grief, just grief, but the loss, a tragic loss of a spouse or a child. I read everything I could on the opioid epidemic. I just gobbled up everything that I thought could help me understand this thing. So for me, I have always found solace in books. And when I just read as much as I could. And so I encountered people through their stories as well. So much so that it moved me to actually write, when I was ready, my own grief journey as a way of maybe helping others. So that was something that was, I think, really helpful. The other thing I did is I attended GRASP, which is the grief group that I facilitate. It's a national group. It stands for Grief Response After Substance Passing. I attended that group myself for several months, and just tried to be a person. And yet, of course, being a therapist and wanting to help, as you said, I saw how I could open up my own chapter, which I ended up doing. Thankfully, GRASP has rules around you cannot facilitate a group until you are a year after the loss, which is very wise. And when I was right about it that time, I did facilitate the group. So, and now 6 years later, I still am doing that. And what I see in all of the people, I have probably, I don't know, 300 some people on my email list that have come through that group. You know what? Everybody has a different um, a different way of grieving. Their child, their loss is different. That is a person unique to them, and the difference both enriches um, our group, but difference is also the differences are very similar. There's just a bonding, some characteristics that are the same. There's a book I just got done reading. It's called The Same Kind of Different as Me. So differences can be different, but it also can be the same. And so there's comfort in experiencing the similarities of grief, just as there's uniqueness in each person's grief journey. And that can be both embraced and it can be comforting. Because then you realize there's nothing weird or strange about one's own grief. It's unique because grief is unique. And so that's a big message that is so, I think, normalizing to hear when you're new in your grief. And that is, there's nothing weird or strange about your grief. For example, when you said, "Wait, son, are you shining?" That's such a common response. People are like, "Wait, the world isn't dark and cold and why isn't it in sync with how I'm feeling?" We have this sense of
Mhm.
everything around us should be, synchronistic to our emotional state. And then we, over time, realize, well, the world goes on. The sun keeps shining and spring comes, whether we're grieving or not. But isn't that a gift, right? It's a gift. Yeah.
Right on. Yeah. Anything else that you notice that could be a part of this conversation? If any other therapists are listening that are grieving, anything else that you notice might be helpful or something for them to pay attention to? I know that you had recommended to me that I go to a grief group first before coming back to work, because as you know, you could be seeing someone and it's not for grief. And then this used to happen to me all the time because I used to be scared of grief, which is I find interesting now. I used to not want to work with grief. I didn't feel like I could handle it. I felt so tender with grieving people that I couldn't not cry. And so, but it will happen. whether I'm trying to or not. So you had recommended that I did go to a grasp group, which I did many times, and it is like you said, everybody's different, but not one person will, the way that they can hold that, I found to be so wise. And these are non-therapists, but like no one will tell you that's stupid or you shouldn't think or feel that. I have never once heard that. And I will say that I sometimes, now not in quite those crass of terms, but I do hear that in general public all the time. When I say something like, I can't stop thinking about how I let him down, that guilt piece that a lot of people with our type of loss experience.
Absolutely.
And not one of them did what most people want to do, which is say, that wasn't your fault. You did everything you can. You can't think that way. Da da da. And that makes it's well meaning. And I get why people say that. But in that group, they just let you feel it and they know that it's going to shift and move and that you just can feel that for a moment about like, and most people say, well, yeah, you think a lot about those, like, why didn't I do this? Or couldn't I have looked? So anyway, the reason why I'm sharing is I thought that was great advice that you gave because I did find that I needed more time after I went to my first group. I remember saying that explicitly, like, I'm not ready yet. I could just tell. And
Mhm.
so that was great. Anything else in your heart or mind that you think could be helpful to share?
Well, so I guess what I would want to say about what you said earlier about going to that first meeting and all you did was cry, it's important to remember grief is a mind, body, spirit experience, and crying is a wonderful way the body discharges grief. In fact, we know that the chemical elements of tears from grieving are different than tears of joy or tears of happiness. There's differences in those tears, and so the body discharges grief by crying. So being mute and only just crying, it may just be where you were at. So I will say that to people all the time who they'll say, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm crying. And we all say, nope, crying is exactly what your body must need to do right now. So the thing is, we don't want, as therapists, we don't want to be crying, of course, if I can
Yeah.
manage it in session. One of the things that I remember from a very wise mentor from years ago as a newer therapist, in that is when a client asks us about our lived experience, no matter what that is, did you and your husband have marital problems? Did you lose a child? Um, do you have a physical illness? Or whatever, whatever they're, and I remember this wise therapist said a great response is to, you know, pause for a beat and ask the client. But before I answer, Sue, I'm interested. Can you share with me why that's important for you to know, or how would that be helpful for you? Um, to know that information about me? Or, so tell me a little bit about why that question is coming up for you. I'm just curious. And saying it in a very empathic way, but coming from a place of neutral curiosity. And really, it gets to the heart of why clients ask us those questions. Because it's really it's not so much that they really need to know our own personal details. What they need to know, or what they want to feel, really, is reassurance that we get it. And so we'll get that information when we ask the question, okay, tell me a bit about why that would be helpful for you to know more about how, my grief journey is, or more information about my son's, struggle with addiction. And frequently, what happens is that opens the door for them to talk about what they're needing to know about our ability to heal them. And then you know what happens? There it goes. And the whole session can go by and they never actually need to circle back to, well, and you didn't tell me that, Robin, about your son. They never circle back to that, because when I ask the question and then they give me that information, I might say, boy, thank you for sharing that. I can see where it's important for you to know that I had that lived experience, and then I don't have to go into the details. They don't need my details because I open the door for them to tell me why they want to know that information or why that's important to them. I just have found that kind of question to be so important as a therapist to ask in all kinds of situations where clients want to know something about our personal life. They really don't want to know those personal details.
Right.
There's something else that they need to know. And so that's what we need to give them.
I think that's beautiful. And something that I thought of when you were talking about that is I recently came across this idea that only about 10% of what we say is basically like that people hear. Like the content of our language is very small percentage of what a person experiences being with another in relation, and that about 90% of it is that felt experience, the energy, the empathy, like getting the sense of what's underneath the words. And I think that often when you say clients want to get it, sometimes what I've noticed in the past is that they also, there can be a felt sense of getting it without having to go into details, because really once they hear it, they might feel even more separated or more not heard, because like you said, we're all so different. And so I think there is a piece there that offers space to share that like a resonance that's beyond words. And so that can create that you get it piece, because as we know, we don't have to have had lived experience with every single event that our clients have, and it's impossible
Exactly.
really.
Right. Right.
But we can, and like you said, it's taken years for me as a therapist to really get to the space of that attunement and that ability to share it with them without me have it in my regular life, or even me having to take it fully on. I can kind of share that. Is that kind of what you were noticing and saying in that?
Absolutely. And that's it's a humbling statistic, isn't it? To know that clients may not remember everything we say. In fact, they remember less than half. And that number 10%, boy, that's a little startling, right? But
Hmm.
that's the whole thing about the instrument of our healing is our whole self, our mind, body, spirit, and the energy that we send to them, the aura around us, how we use the instrument of our soul, our very self. And that is truly a healing element. And we must not underestimate that, because it's very powerful, but it can be powerful in ways that may not be helpful to them if we are not keeping our instrument clean and clear and healthy, right?
Right. And I'm not a fan of saying that right now. I'm not necessarily a fan of like the gifts of losing my son, because I don't really, I would rather have him back.
Right.
Versus anything that I've quote gained. But I will say that, and I will say in that I feel that I have a better sense of knowing and understanding myself as the instrument, how you described it. I feel like there's layers and cobwebs and shadows that I had never necessarily taken a peek at, that grief illuminated for me. And that I do feel like I know I have a sense of my somatic awareness. And I thought I was pretty darn aware. And I thought I'd been in therapy since third grade, right? Like I've done so much work, but I feel that I now have a greater understanding of like, or just a more illuminated understanding and awareness of myself and my presence. And just I'm not so focused now on the content or the perfect intervention, even though I'd like to say that I wasn't. I do think I did rely or lean on interventions. And now I'm kind of like, human relation. I get that now. We always said the therapeutic relationship, we know was the most important aspect, but I don't think I think it's changed for me now, that idea. I feel so much more confident with the relational aspect of it, that I didn't have that necessarily, that feeling of confidence that like I don't have to say the perfect thing. We don't have to use the perfect intervention, which I'm trained on many of them and I will use them, but it's the relational aspect of being with that I now just put my full trust into.
Yeah.
And I don't
Yeah.
know if you had any of those
Well,
experiences.
yes. What I loved what you said is that while none of us wish grief for grief and would trade it for anything, lose someone we love, especially when it's out of the natural order of things, quote unquote. Our children should not die before us. However, when you said that your grief, because of the work you've done, has illuminated the spaces within you, when we dive deep, and with a non-judgment and curiosity, and dive into all of those spaces within us, we're giving ourselves a gift that comes from the pain of loss. And as we heal, we have to dive into those spaces. And as I love that word, as we illuminate those dark spaces, we bring light into our very ourselves, and you shine with that light. And I think anybody, a therapist who's done that work, shines with that illumination, and that illumination of that lightness, and that awareness, and that hard earned kind of knowing allows us to stumble over interventions or the perfect sentence, and there's a sense of healing. I felt that when I did something totally outside my comfort zone in my healing journey, which is I saw a shaman. I'm a Christian. Shamans, thought is, and also as a therapist, I thought shamans, like, they didn't go to graduate school and learn how to be a therapist. And my experience of that shaman, I wrote about that in my book, Spirit Son. I'm like, this person is just imbued with this healing presence, and just being in his presence for the amount of time that he did his shamanic work, it was illuminating, to use your word, Juniper. So healing shines forth from us, and as we have done the work we need to do to be grounded, centered therapists.
All the above. And I am aware our time is kind of wrapping up. I think as therapists, we have like ESP when it comes to like the hours up. Like I know when it's elapsed, I'm like, oh, it feels about right. So I know that time is with us. So thank you so much for sharing. And I wish we could just talk for like at least 5 hours.
One of those giant long sessions, right?
Right. But we can continue the conversation another way. Thank you so much. I know you have work and all that.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Juniper, for inviting me. And I hope that this conversation is of help to your listeners, and I'd be happy to come back anytime. So thank you for this opportunity.